The light changed while he was still standing there. Cars surged forward anyway, tires whispering over damp pavement. The old man kept his hand on the metal pole and watched the numbers blink down. Across the street, people moved without looking back. He waited, shoulders slightly folded inward today, quietly. A bus exhaled at the curb behind him. The doors opened, closed again. Someone laughed somewhere down the block. The old man glanced toward the crossing, then back to the light as if it might change its mind. His shoes stayed planted, toes near the painted line today again, quietly. On the opposite corner, a young woman shifted the strap of her backpack. She had paused without meaning to. The crowd behind her edged forward, impatient in small ways, shuffling feet, quick sighs. She watched the man across the lanes of morning traffic and noticed he had not moved once. The signal blinked red numbers again. 20, 19. 18, people crossed anyway, weaving through turning cars with practiced confidence. The old man did not step forward. He lifted his chin slightly, studying the distance the way someone might study cold water before deciding whether to enter today alone, quietly still. She checked the time on her phone, though she already knew she wasn't late yet. Morning classes left little room for wandering thoughts, but something about the man's stillness held her attention. Everyone else seemed built for the rhythm of lights and engines. He looked separate from it this morning. A delivery truck rolled past, rattling bottles somewhere inside its metal frame. The sound lingered after it turned the corner. The old man shifted his weight once carefully, as if testing a sore knee. Then he settled again beside the pole and watched the signal cycle back again today quietly. The young woman stepped closer to the curb. She told herself she was only moving with the crowd. Still, her eyes returned to him. His coat looked older than the weather required, brown wool with soft elbows. One hand rested on the pole, the other hung loosely today again quietly. Traffic surged when the light changed for them. A tide of people crossed quickly, shoes tapping the white stripes. The woman moved halfway out before stopping again. The old man remained where he was. Drivers leaned impatiently on their horns somewhere farther down the avenue this morning again quietly today. She stepped back to the curb beside him before quite deciding to do it. Up close, she saw the thin blue veins along his hand and the careful way he held himself upright. He noticed her presence but did not look surprised, only patient today again, quietly standing there still. "Morning," she said almost automatically. The word came out softer than expected. The old man nodded once, eyes still on the opposite corner. Cars slipped through the intersection in quick intervals. The signal above them counted silently toward another chance neither had taken, yet this morning again quietly waiting here. He cleared his throat lightly before answering. "Morning." His voice carried the roughness of someone unused to speaking early. The wind shifted along the street and lifted the edge of his coat. For a moment both of them watched the traffic as if studying whether today again quietly together there. "Do you need to cross?" she asked after a pause that felt longer than it was. The question seemed obvious once spoken. He looked down the road again, then back at the light, measuring something only he could see today this morning, quietly standing here again with patience and care. "I suppose I do," he said, "just not as quickly as everyone else." A faint smile appeared, brief and apologetic. The woman glanced at the wide stretch of lanes between corners. It did look longer when you imagined walking slowly today across busy morning traffic again, quietly together perhaps soon. Another group crossed while they stood there talking. A cyclist cut between two cars and vanished down the street. The signal reset. Red numbers began their patient countdown again. The old man watched them carefully, as though memorizing each second today quietly with steady eyes and calm breath beside her. "My class starts in 10 minutes, she said, though she did not move. The admission surprised her a little. Usually mornings ran on schedules and alarms. Yet standing here beside him felt oddly separate from the rest of the day this morning again quietly in the city traffic waiting still. The old man noticed the backpack and the notebook tucked beneath her arm. "College?" he asked. She nodded. A bus roared past behind them, pushing a wave of warm air along the curb. The smell of coffee drifted from somewhere nearby this morning again quietly while traffic moved past them. "What are you studying?" he asked. His eyes had softened with curiosity rather than politeness. She told him history, mostly because she liked old stories that still left marks on ordinary places. He nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense today, quietly beside the street corner again waiting there. The light changed again, and again they did not move. She noticed this only after the numbers had disappeared. The moment slipped past them almost politely. Around them, the city continued its steady breathing of engines, footsteps, and distant sirens this morning again quietly under pale clouds above the avenue. "I used to cross streets without thinking," the old man said quietly. "Funny what becomes complicated." He spoke without bitterness, simply observing. She studied the lines along his face, trying to imagine the younger version he must have been once today standing here again quietly near traffic lights and cars. "What did you do?" she asked. The question felt natural, though they were still strangers. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched a taxi glide through the intersection, yellow paint catching the thin sunlight this morning again quietly while engines hummed and people hurried past them along the curb. "I built things," he said finally. "Bridges, mostly." He pointed gently down the avenue where steel railings bordered an overpass in the distance. "Nothing famous, just pieces that help people get somewhere." The woman followed his gesture quietly today again, watching the traffic beneath gray morning clouds drifting slowly above. She imagined him younger, standing on scaffolding somewhere above water or traffic, measuring beams while wind tugged at his jacket. The picture arrived without effort. The city seemed full of invisible stories like that today this morning again, quietly beneath moving clouds and distant construction sounds echoing along nearby streets. He noticed her thoughtful silence. "Long time ago now," he added. "My legs were steadier then." The statement held no complaint, only recognition. A breeze moved through the intersection, lifting a scrap of newspaper that tumbled across the lanes today again quietly under slow gray clouds drifting above the city. She looked again at the wide street between them and the opposite corner. The distance seemed smaller now that she imagined crossing it slowly, step by step beside him. Her class could wait a little this morning again quietly while traffic rolled past beneath pale clouds and cool spring air. The signal began another countdown. This time she noticed it immediately. 25 seconds, plenty if they started together. She shifted slightly closer so he would not have to reach far if he needed support today again quietly beside the curb while engines idled and horns murmured somewhere beyond the block. "Would you like a hand?" she asked. She offered her arm without ceremony. The old man looked at it, then at her face, measuring the sincerity there. After a moment he placed his hand lightly against her sleeve today again, quietly ready to cross the wide morning street together now. The contact was gentle, almost formal. She felt how carefully he balanced his weight. The light turned green for them. Around them, people stepped forward again, impatient but ordinary. Together, they moved off the curb into the white lines of the crosswalk this morning again, quietly among passing strangers nearby. Cars waited at the line, engines humming softly. The old man took his first step slowly, then another. She matched his pace without thinking about it. The city seemed to pause around their small progress today this morning again, quietly beneath pale clouds drifting over tall buildings and wide streets. Halfway across, he breathed a little deeper but did not stop. She noticed the steadiness in his grip. Not fear exactly, just caution learned slowly over years of walking through crowded streets and changing lights today again, quietly beside patient traffic waiting at the corner under gray morning clouds above. People streamed around them on both sides, quick and practiced. Yet no one brushed against them. The small space they occupied held its own quiet rhythm today this morning again, quietly, while footsteps tapped the painted lines and engines idled behind the waiting cars near the bright corner signal above. She glanced once at the far curb. It was closer now. The old man followed her gaze and smiled faintly, as if the distance had been something the two of them solved together today this morning again, quietly beneath drifting gray clouds above the broad city avenue they crossed slowly. A gust of wind moved along the street and rattled the loose sign above a cafe door. The sound followed them across the remaining stripes of the crosswalk today this morning again, quietly, while traffic waited behind the line and distant voices echoed between tall brick buildings nearby downtown streets. The signal began to blink again behind them, warning the next group to hurry. They kept their pace the same step after careful step toward the curb today this morning again, quietly, while engines murmured, and horns waited somewhere down the long avenue beneath gray clouds drifting above the city. When they reached the curb, he paused before stepping up. She felt the brief shift of his weight, then the small lift as he climbed the edge of the sidewalk today this morning again, quietly, while pedestrians passed behind them carrying coffee cups and folded newspapers along the bright corner. He released her arm slowly but did not move away yet. For a moment they simply stood there, breathing the cooler air of the opposite side of the street, as traffic resumed behind them, and the signal prepared for another quiet cycle today again in the city morning light outside. The old man stayed beside her for a moment after stepping onto the sidewalk, as if allowing the ground beneath his feet to settle into certainty again. Cars flowed behind them now, filling the space they had crossed. The sound returned quickly, engines, brakes, footsteps, like a room inhaling after someone opens a door. "Thank you," he said. He spoke plainly, without ceremony. The words did not carry the exaggerated gratitude she had heard older relatives use when accepting help they didn't quite want. This sounded different, more like an acknowledgement between two people who had briefly shared the same task. "You're welcome," she replied. For a second they stood there looking in opposite directions down the block, neither quite ready to leave yet. Morning traffic thickened slowly as the hour moved forward. A line had begun outside the cafe near the corner. People held paper cups and checked their phones while the smell of roasted coffee drifted into the street. The old man followed that smell for a moment. "Best coffee on this block," he said quietly, nodding toward the shop. She glanced at the window. Inside, a barista moved quickly between machines while someone scribbled orders on small paper cups. "You go there often?" she asked. "Used to," he said. The answer arrived in a tone that suggested a longer explanation might exist somewhere behind it, though he didn't seem inclined to offer one yet. She shifted the strap of her backpack again. "What changed?" He watched the door open and close a few times before answering. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "Just routine moving somewhere else." The statement hung gently between them. She understood the feeling even if she didn't fully know what he meant. Sometimes routines slipped away quietly. One day you stopped doing a thing and then weeks passed before you realized it had disappeared from your life. He took a small breath. "My daughter used to meet me there," he said after a moment. The woman nodded without interrupting. "We'd sit by the window and watch people cross this same street." He glanced back toward the intersection they had just crossed, as though the memory still lived somewhere inside the traffic. "She moved to Oregon a few years ago, work family, that sort of thing." "Do you visit?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. He paused, then added, "Airplanes feel longer than they used to." She smiled slightly at that. The two of them began walking slowly down the sidewalk without really planning to. The pace suited him, and she found herself adjusting naturally. Her class was still somewhere in the back of her mind, but it no longer pressed urgently. Buildings along the block were older brick structures with narrow windows and metal fire escapes that zigzagged toward the pavement. Some storefronts had been updated with polished glass doors. Others still carried faded lettering painted decades ago. He looked at them carefully. "You can tell when a place has been here a long time," he said. "How?" she asked. "The small things that survive updates." He pointed to an iron railing outside a bookstore. "That railing is original," he said. "Probably from the 20s. She examined it. The metal curved in simple loops that someone had clearly shaped by hand rather than machine. "How do you know that?" she asked. He shrugged. "You spend 40 years looking at structures, you start noticing details whether you mean to or not." They passed a narrow alley where sunlight barely reached the pavement. Somewhere inside it, a delivery worker stacked cardboard boxes against a wall. The old man slowed slightly. "Cities hide their age in places like that," he said. "Alleyways?" "Yes." He gestured gently toward the brick walls rising on both sides. "Front streets get repaired, painted, cleaned up." His eyes followed the cracks in the mortar. "But the back sides, they keep their memories longer." She liked the way he said that. There was no poetry in his tone, yet the words carried quiet weight. They walked another half block before she spoke again. "You said you built bridges." "Yes." "Where?" "All over the state," he said. He paused while stepping around a loose patch of pavement. "Mostly smaller ones, county projects, rail crossings." She imagined the long process of building something like that, years of planning, months of labor, thousands of measurements no one would ever see. "Did you like it?" she asked. The question seemed simple enough, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a pair of pigeons hop across the sidewalk in front of them, pecking at crumbs near a trash can. "I like the problem solving," he said finally. "What kind of problems?" "The kind where the answer has to hold weight." She waited. He continued. "You calculate forces, weather, traffic, materials." His voice carried quiet focus now. "And then one day people drive across it without thinking at all." He gave a small smile. "That part was always satisfying," she nodded. "That people trust it?" "Yes." They passed a hardware store with dusty windows full of tools that looked older than both of them combined. He slowed again near the display. "I used to come here," he said. She looked inside. A man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper while an old radio murmured softly on a shelf. "Still looks the same," she said. "That's rare." He rested his hand briefly on the door handle but didn't open it. "Places change owners," he said. "New shelves, new lights." His fingers tapped the metal gently. This one kept its shape. They continued walking. The morning air had warmed slightly now, though a cool breeze still moved along the street between buildings. A cyclist passed them with a soft whir of tires. The old man watched him disappear around the next corner. "I used to bike everywhere when I was your age," he said. She laughed lightly. "I still do sometimes." "Good," he said. "You should keep that habit." They walked another quiet stretch before he asked, "What drew you to history?" She thought about the answer for a second. "I like knowing what happened before," she said. "Not the big events necessarily." "What then?" he asked. "The ordinary parts." He seemed interested. "Like what?" Letters, she said, diaries, old photographs. She looked down the block as they walked. The things people leave behind without meaning to, he nodded slowly. That's where truth usually hides. The comment surprised her. You think so? Yes, he glanced toward a tall office building across the street. History books talk about leaders, wars, decisions. His voice remained calm. But most lives are quieter than that. He gestured toward the sidewalks. People going to work, meeting for coffee. She watched a woman push a stroller past a row of parked cars. Those things matter too. They matter more, he said softly. They reached another intersection. The light here had just turned red. Neither of them seemed particularly eager to rush. The old man leaned lightly against a lamp post. Traffic rolled past in steady waves. You ever notice, he said, how cities train people to move quickly? She nodded. You mean the lights? The lights, the sidewalks, the schedules. He watched a group of office workers hurry across before the signal changed. Everything suggests speed. And that's bad, she asked. Not bad, he considered the word. Just easy to forget you're allowed to slow down. The signal turned green again. This time they didn't cross. They simply remained where they were, watching the movement of the morning. A construction crew worked on the far corner, guiding a crane that lifted metal beams slowly into the air. The old man's eyes followed the motion with professional interest. See that angle? He said quietly. She looked. What about it? The load is swinging slightly off-center. He tilted his head. Operator will correct it in a moment. As if on cue, the crane shifted. The beam steadied. She looked back at him. You still think like an engineer, he shrugged gently. Once you spend decades paying attention to weight and balance, it stays with you. They started walking again after the light changed. The sidewalk here grew quieter, fewer cafes, more office entrances, the kind of buildings where people disappeared through revolving doors carrying briefcases and laptops. She glanced at the time again. Her class had already begun. Oddly, the realization didn't trouble her much. Am I making you late? The old man asked. A little. I'm sorry. It's okay, she said, and she meant it. He studied her expression carefully, as if trying to decide whether she was being polite. You don't seem worried. I'll catch up. He nodded slowly. College gives you some room for wandering. Yes, he smiled faintly. Enjoy that. They stopped near a bench positioned beneath a young maple tree planted in a square cut into the sidewalk. The old man rested his hands on the back of the bench but did not sit. I usually stop here, he said. On your walks? Yes. What for? Just a minute. He looked upward through the thin branches. Old habit, she waited. Construction sites have a lot of noise, he said. Hammers, machines, people shouting measurements. His voice remained steady. I got used to finding quiet places after work. The breeze moved through the leaves above them. Even in early spring, the tree made a soft, rustling sound. This spot works, he said. She listened too. The sound was subtle enough that most people passing would never notice it. Cars moved in the distance. But here beneath the small tree, the noise softened slightly. They stayed there for nearly a minute without speaking. Then he turned to her again. What was your name? She told him. He repeated it once carefully, committing it to memory. And you? She asked. Arthur. The name suited him somehow. Arthur looked down the block where they had come from. That crossing used to feel shorter, he said. Maybe everything did. She didn't respond. Some statements weren't meant for answers. A man in a dark suit hurried past them while speaking loudly into his phone. Arthur watched him go. Everyone's carrying something invisible, he said. She thought about that. What do you mean? Concerns, deadlines, memories. He tapped the bench lightly with his fingers. Wait, you can't see. She considered the idea while a few leaves drifted down from the tree above. Arthur straightened slightly. Well, he said, I suppose I should keep moving. She hesitated. Do you walk every morning? Most mornings. Same route, more or less. She looked back toward the intersection where they had first met. Maybe I'll see you again, she said. Arthur smiled in that same quiet way. Cities are strange that way, he said. You can pass the same person 100 times before noticing. Then he stepped slowly away from the bench and continued down the sidewalk. She remained there for a moment, watching him move carefully but steadily along the street. He did not hurry. He simply walked. Eventually, he turned the corner and disappeared from view. The woman stood beneath the small maple tree a little longer than necessary before finally adjusting her backpack again. The day continued around her. But something about the morning had shifted slightly, though she couldn't yet name exactly what. She turned and began walking back toward the intersection where they had first met. Traffic still moved quickly there. People still crossed in waves. The signals still counted down its silent numbers, but the space felt different now. Less like a place people rushed through, more like a place where something small had quietly happened, and where perhaps something else might happen again tomorrow. The next morning arrived quietly, the way most city mornings do, without ceremony, without announcement. Pale sunlight slid between buildings and rested briefly on the crosswalk paint before traffic wore it away again. She noticed the intersection sooner than usual as she approached, not because anything had changed, but because now she knew someone who belonged to it. The signal blinked its red numbers. People waited. Others crossed early, slipping between cars with practiced confidence. The same rhythm as yesterday. Still, her eyes searched automatically. For a moment she wondered if it had been coincidence, one passing encounter that cities produce and swallow without trace. Then she saw him. Arthur stood beside the same metal pole, one hand resting lightly against it. His brown coat looked exactly as it had the day before, though the morning air carried slightly more warmth. He noticed her almost at the same time. Recognition moved across his face slowly, like sunlight shifting across a room. "Well," he said as she reached the curb. "History student." "Builder," she replied. The exchange felt natural, as if they had already practiced it. Traffic moved past them in steady waves. Arthur looked toward the opposite side of the street. "Looks just as long today," he said. She smiled. "Good thing I came by." They waited through one signal cycle without speaking much. A bus roared past. Someone dropped a coin that bounced across the pavement before disappearing beneath a parked car. Ordinary sounds. Arthur cleared his throat. "You heading to class again?" "Yes." "Same one, history of urban planning." He raised an eyebrow. "Cities studying themselves." "Something like that." The signal began counting down again. This time, when the light changed, she offered her arm without asking. Arthur accepted it with the same quiet formality as yesterday. Together they stepped into the crosswalk. Cars idled behind the painted line. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and fresh bread drifting from a bakery farther down the block. Arthur moved carefully, but his steps carried more confidence now, perhaps because he knew the distance already. Halfway across he said, "You know, I used to measure crossings like this." "For work?" "Yes," he nodded toward the traffic lights. "Pedestrian timing, lane width, traffic flow." She looked around. "You help design intersections." "Sometimes," he chuckled softly. "Though I doubt anyone remembers." They reached the far curb without trouble. Arthur stepped up slowly. "See," he said. "Practice helps." They continued walking together down the sidewalk again. Morning commuters streamed around them in quick currents, but their pace remained unhurried. Arthur stopped briefly near the cafe window. Inside, the same barista moved between machines. "Would you like coffee?" he asked. She hesitated. "My class." Then she looked through the glass again. "I suppose 5 minutes won't ruin anything." Arthur pushed open the door. Warm air and the smell of roasted beans wrapped around them instantly. The shop hummed with low conversation and the steady hiss of the espresso machine. They found a small table by the window. Arthur ordered black coffee. She ordered tea. For a few minutes they sat quietly, watching people pass outside. The intersection remained visible through the glass. Arthur lifted his cup carefully. "You know," he said, "I designed a pedestrian bridge once." "Where?" "Upstate." He stirred his coffee slowly. "Small town near the river." "What was special about it?" "Nothing dramatic." He smiled faintly, but the town had an elementary school on one side of the highway and a park on the other. She listened. "Kids used to cross the road between classes." "That sounds dangerous." "It was," he nodded. "So the town hired us to build a bridge over the highway." Arthur looked out the window again. "The day it opened, the entire school walked across together." "That must have felt good," he shrugged slightly. "It felt useful." They drank quietly for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck blocked half the lane while workers unloaded crates. Arthur watched them carefully. "You see the way they're stacking those boxes?" She looked. "They're balancing the weight." "Yes," he nodded approvingly. "Instinct," she smiled. "You really do see structure everywhere." Arthur considered that. "Maybe." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "When you spend enough years thinking about how things hold together, you start noticing when they don't." She rested her chin lightly against her hand. "What made you choose that kind of work?" Arthur thought for a moment. "My father built houses," he said. "I grew up around blueprints and sawdust." He traced a small circle on the table with his finger. "I liked the idea that something you made could stay standing long after you were gone." The statement landed gently between them, not heavy, just honest. She asked, "Do you ever go back to see the bridges?" "Sometimes." "And?" "They're usually covered in rust and new paint." He smiled. "Which means people are still using them." The barista wiped the counter while humming quietly to a song playing somewhere behind the machines. Arthur finished his coffee. "Well," he said, glancing toward the window, "the city will start charging rent if we stay too long." She laughed softly. They stepped outside again. The air felt brighter now. Arthur walked beside her toward the corner where their paths would eventually split. "You know," he said, "I've lived in this neighborhood almost 40 years. "Really?" "Yes." He pointed toward a narrow street 2 blocks away. "Apartment over there." "What keeps you here?" Arthur looked up at the buildings. "The same things that keep bridges standing." She waited. "Familiar weight." They reached the intersection again. Traffic surged through the green light. Arthur watched it thoughtfully. "Funny," he said. "What?" "That crossing looked impossible yesterday." She nodded. "But today it doesn't." Arthur rested his hand on the pole again. Perspective. They stood there quietly for a moment. Then she checked the time. Okay, she said reluctantly. Now I really should go. Arthur nodded. History needs its students. And cities need their bridges, he smiled. They stood facing each other for a moment, both slightly uncertain how to end the conversation. Arthur solved it by extending his hand. She shook it. His grip felt steady despite the thinness of his fingers. Good luck with your studies, he said. You too, he laughed softly. I'm finished studying. You're still teaching, she said. Arthur seemed to consider that. Maybe. She turned toward the subway entrance down the block. Halfway there, she glanced back. Arthur had not moved yet. He still stood beside the pole, watching the traffic with quiet patience. The same way she had first seen him, only now the scene felt different, not because the street had changed, but because she understood something about the man standing there, and perhaps he understood something about her too. The city continued its steady movement around them. Cars rolled forward, signals blinked, people hurried past. Yet in the middle of that motion, two small routines had quietly intersected, and neither of them quite realized yet how long the memory of it would last. The following week passed with the usual quiet accumulation of days. Classes, reading assignments, coffee cups balanced on library tables. The low rustle of notebook pages turning while professors spoke about city grids designed centuries earlier by people who had never imagined the traffic those streets would eventually carry. The intersection remained where it had always been, but now it existed somewhere in her awareness even when she wasn't near it. On Tuesday morning, she arrived early enough to see Arthur again. He stood beside the pole, studying the signal the same way he always did, as though measuring the moment when patience would turn into movement. He noticed her approach. Well, he said. Well, she answered. Neither of them mentioned that they had both clearly chosen to arrive at roughly the same time. The routine developed naturally after that. Most mornings she would see him waiting there. Sometimes she arrived first. Sometimes he did. Once or twice he had already crossed before she reached the corner, and she would spot him halfway down the block moving steadily along the sidewalk. Those mornings felt strangely incomplete, not dramatic, just slightly out of alignment. One Thursday, the weather turned colder again. Wind moved sharply between the buildings, pushing newspapers along the curb and tugging at coat collars. Arthur stood with both hands in his pockets that morning. Feels like winter remembered us, he said. She nodded. Spring is indecisive. They crossed together as usual. Arthur moved carefully but without hesitation now. The distance no longer seemed intimidating. Halfway across he said, Funny thing about habits. What? They grow roots quickly. She considered that. You mean crossing the street with me? He smiled faintly. That too. They reached the opposite curb. Arthur paused there a moment longer than usual. Are you busy this afternoon? He asked. I have a lecture. Before or after lunch? Before. He nodded. I walk through the park some afternoons. She looked at him. The one near the library? Yes. Maybe I'll come by. Arthur seemed pleased by the idea but didn't say much more about it. They parted at the corner as they always did. The park sat 3 blocks from campus. It was not large, just a rectangle of grass and old trees bordered by iron fencing. Children sometimes played there after school. Office workers ate sandwiches on the benches during lunch hours. She arrived around 2 o'clock. Arthur sat on a wooden bench facing a small pond where ducks moved slowly through the water. You found it, he said. I did. She sat beside him. For several minutes they watched the ducks without speaking. Wind moved lightly through the branches above them. Arthur pointed toward the pond. See that one there? A duck paddled slightly behind the others. It's adjusting its path for the current, he said. She looked closely. How can you tell? The angle of its head. He smiled. Same principle as a bridge. She laughed softly. Everything comes back to bridges with you. Arthur didn't deny it. A group of children ran past chasing a soccer ball. Their voices echoed briefly through the trees before fading again. Arthur watched them thoughtfully. You ever think about how much of life is spent crossing things? He asked. What do you mean? Roads, rivers, years. She tilted her head. I guess I never thought of it that way. Arthur leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. When I was younger, he said, I believed building something permanent was the most important thing a person could do. She listened quietly. But permanence turns out to be complicated. How so? He watched the ducks again. Bridges last a long time, but not forever. No, Arthur nodded. Eventually they need repairs, reinforcement, replacement. She understood what he meant even before he said the next part. People are similar. The statement did not sound sad, just factual. Arthur glanced at her. You helped me cross a street last week. Yes, but you also reminded me of something. What? That most crossings are easier when someone walks beside you. The wind shifted through the trees again. A few leaves drifted down near their feet. They sat there quietly while the afternoon moved slowly around them. After a while, Arthur stood up carefully. My daughter used to bring her son here when he was little, he said. You have a grandson? Yes, he's 10 now. Arthur smiled slightly. Tall already. Do you see him often? Video calls mostly. He shrugged gently. Technology builds its own bridges. They began walking slowly along the gravel path beside the pond. Arthur moved steadily but with the same deliberate pace she had come to recognize. You know, he said, I've crossed that intersection thousands of times. Really? Yes. Why was last week different? Arthur thought about the question. Maybe it wasn't the street that changed. She looked at him. Maybe it was the company. They walked another quiet lap around the pond before returning to the bench. The afternoon sun had shifted lower now, casting long shadows across the grass. Arthur checked the time. I should head back before the evening rush. They left the park together. At the intersection where their paths separated, they paused as usual. Traffic moved steadily through the lanes. Arthur rested his hand briefly on the metal pole again. Funny thing, he said. What? For 40 years, this corner was just a corner. And now it's a place where I met someone who studies the past, she smiled. And I met someone who built the roads we walk on. Arthur extended his hand again. This time the gesture felt less formal, more familiar. Take care, he said. You too. She watched him cross slowly toward the opposite side of the street. Cars waited behind the line. Pedestrians passed on either side. Arthur moved at the same careful pace he always used. But now the crossing looked different. Not shorter, not easier, just shared. When he reached the far curb, he turned slightly and lifted one hand in a small wave before continuing down the sidewalk. She remained at the corner for a moment. Traffic resumed its steady rhythm. The signal blinked again. People hurried past without noticing anything unusual about the place. And perhaps nothing unusual had happened. Just a brief conversation. A few shared walks. A crossing or two. But some moments remain longer than they should. Not because they are large, but because they arrive quietly and settle somewhere inside the memory without asking permission. The light changed again. Cars rolled forward. Someone laughed near the cafe door. The city continued doing what cities do, moving people from one place to another. Yet whenever she approached that intersection afterward, she found herself slowing slightly, looking toward the pole. Listening for the familiar voice that might say something simple about the weather or the traffic or the strange way habits grow roots. Sometimes Arthur was there. Sometimes he was. But the crossing remained. Painted lines stretching from one curb to the other. A short distance in the map of the city. A slightly longer one in the memory of two people who had once walked it together.